Today, Istvan has arranged to travel to the city. He would much prefer to go by bicycle, but he needs to arrive looking his best. He has important meetings with his lawyer to complete the arrangements to transfer the ownership of the estate, and he has a meeting with the bank, so he's driving his carriage. Istvan has completed his business in the city. The legal work is all completed and registered with the court. He is now the official owner of the estate, and his first action was to deposit the deeds of the estate with the bank to secure a significant loan of Hungarian koruna. His father might not approve that the estate is now mortgaged, but Istvan is determined to bring the estate into the 20th century. Istvan has arranged to meet Jan Horvath, the owner of Kazinchad Building Company. "Good morning, Jan. The money is secured with the bank. How are things with you?" "That's great news, Mr. Kovacs. I sent a telegram to my friend in Budapest, and he has arranged for the supply of the equipment from the GANS works. They will send one of their experts to work with us to install the steam turbines and generators. Erno Vilcek is new to GANS, but has been working on similar projects in France and England. I'm sure with his directions we will be able to install the turbo generator once it arrives. But there's much work to be done first to build somewhere to house it. I've had an architect draw up the plans. I think it will fit the site here exactly where you want it. But it will take some months to build, so I suspect we will not be running until early next year. Unfortunately, we've had a delay with the work for the night soil. The plans that we had agreed had a fault, and we have been forced to start the work again. This was all outside of our control. I'm sorry for that, Mr. Kovacs, as it will delay when I can start on your project. The storage for the wood cutting is nearly completed, so that's good news. I heard about the problem with the night soil extension, an unfortunate event that can't be helped. You received the order to also build us some vehicle storage at the wood cutting." "Yes, Mr. Kovacs, the estate manager discussed it with me. We will start on that as soon as the storage area is completed. I'm grateful for the work, of course, but our capacity is limited. I'm looking at bringing in some more help from the city." "That's fine, Jan. I'm sure you will do your best to make a start here in the next few months. As we agreed, we will pay the first instalment only once you have started. We are going to bring Kazinchad into the 20th century, Jan, but Rome was not built in a day." My name is Mark from Canny Gaming, and welcome to episode 7 of our series of Building a Republic in Soviet Republic Workers and Resources in 1910, inspired by the development of the Kosice region, which is today in Slovakia. But in 1910, Kosice was still a part of the Kingdom of Hungary and used the currency of Hungary, the koruna, or referred to as the krona or crown in other languages. It bears a picture of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph, who had been ruler of Hungary for just over 60 years. The GANS Works in Budapest was a major industrial company that had started in 1844, casting wheels for railway engines at their foundry. GANS played a major role in the development of railways in Hungary, going on to produce rail locomotives. Their operations also extended to electrical engineering, and several famous engineers worked for the company and played a significant historical role in the development of AC power. Mikhail Derry, Otto Blatty, and Karowy Zipanovsky were those engineers. Derry and Zipanovsky invented an AC generator in 1883, and in 1885 with Blatty they invented the transformer. In 1886 they designed the electrical equipment for the world's first power station to use AC generators in Rome, and GANS installed that. In 1889 Derry organised and equipped the first electric power station in Vienna, though the main domestic power station to provide power to homes and offices in the city was not built until 1910. Small private power stations had been the norm in the late 19th century. By 1910 these engineers were all over 50. Derry was 66. I'm not sure how much day-to-day involvement they had in the operations at GANS by then. They were the heads of departments and factory directors, and very unlikely to get involved in Istvan's small-scale project. There is no reason on earth why GANS would send one of their top managers. But Erno Vilcek, who is coming to Kazinchad, was a real-life engineer who had graduated from Budapest University of Art and Design in 1905. After working for companies in France and England distributing electric generators, he returned to Hungary to work for Ganz. Wilczek became part of the next generation of famous engineers that worked for the company. He really was just starting his career with them in 1910. Later he became head of the engineering department. It is not clear whether there was any electricity being generated anywhere in the Kosice region by 1910. The city had a tram system which opened in 1895, but it started with horse-drawn units on rails in the city and then got some steam-powered ones. The tram system was not electrified until 1913, and it was that which also seems to have introduced electric street lighting into the city. Before that, coal gas was being used for heating and lighting, so I think I would be justified not to have electricity in my republic in 1910 at all. But I want to make a start on introducing electricity. I said in episode 6 that we had introduced all of the major infrastructure systems in the game: water, sewage, heating, waste. But that ignored electric power. By 1910, the technology to use electricity was 20 to 30 years old, and clearly there were major discussions and plans to introduce electrical power in Kosice, even if they were not yet fully realized, and I think we should reflect that. But it is worth noting that we are definitely not going to be able to justify building large-scale power stations with high-voltage lines crossing our republic. And a restriction I am placing on myself: I am not going to have any electricity imported across the border. That was one of the reasons I demolished the high-voltage power lines, etc. from next to the highway in episode 6. Any electricity supply in Kosice would not have gone outside the city, though by then Ganz had installed a project connecting 6 water turbines in Tivoli to the steam generators of the Rome power plant over 28 kilometres away. So it was technically possible, but by 1910 most electrical installations, where they existed, were still locally based and were not supplying power to rural communities. And the early power stations had often been surprisingly small. The steam turbine was invented by the Irishman Charles Parsons in 1884, and Parsons is most famous for using his invention to promote the use of steam turbines in ships. Parsons established his own company in 1888 and then built the Turbinia, powered by one of his steam turbines. Turbinia is most famous for turning up at the Diamond Jubilee celebrations for Queen Victoria in 1897 in the English Channel off Portsmouth. The British fleet was drawn up in 2 massive lines of warships, and Turbinia proceeded to steam up and down the line at what at that time was an unimaginable speed for a ship. Parsons, of course, wanted to get maximum publicity from the exercise. The Navy sent a small ship to intercept Turbinia, but it was unable to catch Parsons' ship. Subsequently, he sold his steam turbine design to the Navy, and the first steam turbine-powered warship was launched in 1906, called HMS Dreadnought. Her unique design at that time caused a whole class of warships to be named dreadnoughts. It also set off an arms race as the great powers competed to make bigger, faster and more powerful ships for their navies. Steam turbines on all types of ships started to become the norm from about 1910, and by then most power stations that were not powered by flowing water were being powered by steam turbines burning coal, with some sort of generator such as that invented by the engineers at Ganz to convert the motion of the turbine into electricity. The whole arrangement is referred to as a turbo generator. This is an example of an early steam turbine generator built by Ganz. In this case, for a new power station they built in Belgium from 1911 to 1913, I think on the right is the steam boiler, in the centre is the turbine that the steam causes to spin, and on the left is the electric generator. We can see the name Ganz on the equipment in 2 places. On the wall at the back we can see it says Turbo Alternator number 6, and it generated 12,500 kilowatts, in other words 12.5 megawatts. That numbering suggests there were at least 6 of them in the Belgian power station. We can see from this picture how big the power station was, so perhaps there were even more than 6. It seems it was just this time when industrial concerns and cities, started to commission these sort of big power stations as the technology developed. But the outbreak of war in 1914 meant most examples like this were built in the 1920s. I took inspiration for the Kovacs powerhouse from this real-life building in northern England. It was eventually converted to a gardener's cottage, but it started life as a power plant providing electricity to a country estate. I can't find a picture of it when it was a working power plant, but I believe it will have had a steam turbine inside of it. And we can see from the size of some of those early steam turbines that one would fit in a building of that size. I also took inspiration from the Cragside estate built in 1878 by the industrialist William Armstrong from the north of England. Armstrong powered his estate entirely from a generator using a dynamo made by the German company Siemens. He didn't use a coal-fired steam turbine, but used a hydroelectric system, which would be interesting to include in our republic. But I am happy to use a coal-powered turbo generator for the Kovacs estate, and the relevance to us of Cragside is also to see the size of the building that housed the power plant and the size of the generator equipment. That equipment generally increased in size over the decades, but only because the technology was being used to generate megawatts of power to supply whole cities, rather than kilowatts for small-scale systems. But even small-sized steam turbo generators could generate significant power for the time, powering ships, lighting streets and cities, and providing power for early tram systems. The 3D model I used is not mine, it's from the workshop and another one of the wonderful assets from Quickelbendig. He produced it as part of the pre-war water facilities pack, where it was a small electric pumping plant. I took out the underground mechanics and gave it an outside storage area for coal to be unloaded. I also made it generate some pollution, and then set the building script as a coal-fired power station. It produces far less electricity than a more modern power station. At full production, my mod is just 40 megawatts, rather than 1,400 for the vanilla coal-fired power station that you might build in 1960. And of course, unlike a hydroelectric version, the new powerhouse needs to be kept supplied with coal, so I included a storage area on the right as we look at it. And finally, as well as the powerhouse itself, the site needs a small distribution office that also needs to be constructed, as this will be a functional asset. Coal needs to be brought to the powerhouse by dumpers, and they can operate from here. I've ended up with quite a few distribution and tech offices in Kazinchad already, and while the ones I adapted from the workshop and made my own skins for have quite a bit of variation, they're starting to look a bit repetitive, because I limited myself to only use the 4 vehicle versions. So I found an alternative small and simple distribution office in the workshop and then modded that. That holds 3 vehicles, and there's a tiny version that holds only 1. I've published that in the workshop. I managed to make 13 different buildings out of those 2 3D models and then make 3 additional skins for them. There's distribution offices, tech offices, construction, storage, fire stations, and a vehicle repair office. So it's a nice little pack of buildings that you can use in an early start. Originally I intended that the powerhouse building would not be provided with any power connections, either for high voltage nor even a low voltage one. The game allows a power station to act like a power substation and to supply power to any other building within range. That's within about 340 metres. So that would work to cover the Kovacs estate, but I can see if I make this available in the workshop that some people might prefer to extend the range it covers by using low voltage cables connected to substations. The technology was available for that in 1910, even if it was not often being used, so I provided 4 low voltage connections that are available from each of the corners of the building. Powerhouse, of course, requires workers, 8 of them, so it is a further significant requirement for workers in Kazinchad, and you can start to see why Istvan is not interested in using the available workforce to chop down trees or work in the fields. We will see in a later episode exactly why Istvan wants to build his own powerhouse on the estate. I mentioned in Istvan Story that there was a problem with the night soil distribution office. We saw that being planned to be built by the Kazinchad building company in the last episode. Off camera, I let the game run for a few months and found that the additional storage at the woodcutter was completed by the construction office without any problems. But the distribution office was not progressing at all, even when it was the only project the construction office had. It had completed phase 1 of the construction, the groundworks, but didn't move on to phase 2, laying bricks. It has the resources, it had a road connection, everything seemed to be in place. There was no problem if you paid for the building, but it didn't work with the construction office. I found I'd made an error in the building script of the mod, and that's what I am referring to in the story. The game won't update the script for a building once you have planned construction, even if you update the underlying mod in the workshop. The game has to be reloaded and the building demolished and started again so that the game will then load up the new script. By the way, this is even the case with the vanilla buildings if the developer changes them and you have a game underway. It's one issue when I am creating new mods or amending mods that need to be tested, changed and tested again. We have a supply of wood being delivered to both the firewood merchant and the night soil disposal. And there is the possibility of selling wood at the customs or to the sawmill. Currently both the firewood merchant and the night soil have deliveries made by vehicles assigned to lines. That's not the most efficient way of doing it, and I showed in a previous episode that we have the research completed to build distribution offices. A small distribution office at the woodcutter would be useful to manage the deliveries, and I think it makes sense for the Kovacs estate to deliver wood to their customers, rather than the other way around. As I also mention later, we are considering here the business arrangements. Would a woodcutting business provide a delivery service? And I think the answer is certainly yes. And that fits in nicely with the improvements that Istvan and the estate manager are making. Plus, one thing with lines is that there is no real ownership of the vehicles on a line. The game doesn't emphasize this much because it is set during the Soviet era, where everything is in theory owned by the state, and all purchases, maintenance and disposals of vehicles are done by the state. In 1910, all the vehicles had a specific private owner. There were no state-owned vehicles unless they belonged to the military or perhaps the post office. With these vehicles distributing wood, the farm vehicles owned by the Kovacs estate, and the carriage you saw earlier, then we need to consider how they are maintained. We need to implement vehicle maintenance into the Republic soon. Even horses and horse-drawn carts needed maintenance in real life. Note that the storage area has just been completed and wood is being stored there. Fortunately, because as the estate manager noted in an earlier episode, here in summer that internal storage of 50 tons soon gets full and the woodcutter has to stop producing more wood because currently there is no demand for wood from the firewood merchant who provides heating in the winter only. In total, we will be able to store 380 tons here ready for winter. So that looks like a good reason to start the construction of the distribution office, though we need to build the roadway first. And let's go back and restart the construction of the night soil distribution. I had disabled auto search for buildings because we now have several buildings planned and need to manage that. In the story you see a carriage, which is a personal vehicle in the game. This building has the functionality of being a parking area for personal vehicles that I created, using a 3D model for a farm building so that it would look like stables. I added that to the farm area off camera before the last episode. The mod has 10 parking spaces, all inside the building out of sight. I have deliberately left those 10 spaces free. I'm treating it as stables where people can leave their horses. I placed next to it a mud parking area with just one space. I have mods from the workshop that allow horses to be used as personal vehicles, and also a mod that provides 2 types of carriages. So I bought one of them and placed it there. I used a separate parking space so that the carriage was parked outside and visible. In real life, they probably placed the carriage inside of a garage of some sort, but I wanted it to be visible. While I was happy to have the horses park inside and not be visible except when they are riding along the roads. Note, you can't actually allocate a personal vehicle to a particular person in the game, nor even to guarantee that it will go to someone living in a particular house. The game allocates the vehicles using only the criteria that is set for age and education, and party loyalty if you have the research for it, which we don't. So the carriage has not been allocated to anyone living in the Kovacs house. But it is nice to see the carriage being used occasionally, and we can role-play that it is the Kovacs family that are using it. I used the same mod to also build stables here in the hamlet next to the farm. Here I have bought horses and filled all the spaces, allowing the game to allocate these to people living nearby. So 10 people living in the hamlet have personal vehicles that they can use to travel around to go to work or meet their needs during their free time. Though of course that only works if there are free parking spaces available near where they want to go, which is why we need to have the stables in the main part of the village and keep it free. But first, let's briefly remind ourselves that this is all Kazinchad as identified by the game. The village square is here, which is almost exactly 1 kilometre away along the road. This area in front of us is what I mean by the hamlet. Maybe it should have its own name. I quite like Dolny Kazinchad, meaning Lower Kazinchad in Hungarian, but most of the people who live here, despite it being part of Hungary in 1910, are Slovaks. So let's call it Malakaz, meaning small Kazinchad in Slovakian, and we will pretend that people in the area will just shorten it to Malakaz. You can force the game to create a new city area from the Terrain Tools menu. The game will treat Malakaz as an independent city area, and it would need its own city hall type building if we wanted detailed stats. I don't want to go that far, but it makes sense for me to call this something other than the hamlet and for that to be reflected on the map. If we haven't changed the name of a building, then the game will rename them for us, but if we have changed them, then it leaves our name alone. So I'm going to have to sort that out because I rename most buildings, such as the bread factory and its associated buildings. By the way, you see here a little of my design principles. I don't just build a factory, but a company, organisation, corporation, partnership, business, call it what you want. Here in Upper Hungary in 1910, there is still capitalism and private ownership. The bread factory owner has a building to make the bread, a storage area attached to it to store crops and bread. He doesn't store his wood in the warehouse, it's just dumped in the yard outside of the factory when it gets delivered from the woodcutter. And since he delivers his bread to the businesses that buy it, i.e. the shops, then he has his own distribution office for his vehicles to operate when shops need bread. And you see that I tend to clearly demarcate such a business with its own area, surrounded by fences or walls. That is much more realistic, I think, and actually just as realistic when we get to the Soviet era. Factories had fences round them, often high fences with barbed wire, and they typically had gates with security guards monitoring who came in and out. Now, any of you who have been following this series, and thank you, by the way, it's fantastic to see, you know that I don't like factory connections. There is one there between the factory and warehouse. It's hidden under gravel so you don't see the ugliness. So just to prove it is there, crops from the storage go into the factory and food comes back out. Since we have a company, we ought to have a company owner. Let's build a house on the site which we can role play this is where the owner lives. Now, if I'm super critical of this area, it is all of this open space. The 3 buildings have roads which join together near the entrance. You no longer see the gravel roads with the decorative gravel effect covering them. Unless I find the node for the junction, then you can see they are there. And of course you can see that vehicles are going back and forward and must be following roads. That gives us the impression of a single open yard area, which is nice to be able to do it in one way, but it's far too big for my liking. Because we have collision disabled on all these assets, this is still far more compact than we could get on a vanilla build, but the collision on the roads, which we can't avoid, restricts us a bit here, including the issue that the game does not allow very short lengths of road. If we look at 19th century industrial buildings, even in fairly rural settings, the industrial buildings are an eclectic mix of small buildings, often very close together. They were generally not spread out on large open sites. In Europe by 1910, there had been hundreds of years of development of places like Kazinchad, sometimes even thousands. New buildings were added to existing buildings. They were altered, expanded, pulled down and rebuilt. I think I would have preferred to make the whole complex smaller. I would have cut off the site here. Then there would be room for more buildings along the road. I looked long and hard at this and decided we can do better. I created a new version of the bread factory with a different set of connections, loading areas, etc., but the same 3D model. Just to show that these are different, let's build them side by side. Original on the right, new one on the left. The first thing is that you see the new version has a bigger gravel area. I've kept the gravel area in the corner area between the two parts of the building on both, but added an area on the back on the new one. When I say back and front, I mean in terms of how they appear to us looking from the road, because of course they can be rotated and mirrored. The road connections are the opposite way around. Originally on the right, going into the gravel area, where there is a door on the side of the building. To me this looks like a back entrance, and that's absolutely fine. This looks more like the front with the sign above the double doors. The sign originally had lettering on it in the original asset, but that doesn't look right when you mirror the asset. So I had already replaced that with the pictures of the bread icon the game uses. It's a bit crude, but my artistic skills don't go any further than that. To have this road connection then makes sense. I have placed the two loading areas within that new gravel area rather than at the back. Otherwise the vehicles would try to drive right through the building to get from the road to the bays. I also moved the waste container to be here too. You can tell the game where to place the waste containers, though generally you just let it decide, and it does a pretty good job. But I wanted to be sure it was right in that corner, out of the way. Space is going to be tight here. So you might be forgiven for thinking, Mark, we now have a building facing the opposite direction, but it now has a bigger footprint. How does that improve anything to reduce the overall size of the factory complex? This is not really the size of each individual asset, but about how they fit together, and particularly how they connect to the roads. The factory is going to have a storage warehouse. It wants a road connection only for 4 things: fire engines, waste trucks, sewage collection, and wood deliveries. Note the factory is not going to get any deliveries of crops to it, nor any pickups of food, because we are planning to have those vehicles always come to the storage warehouse. But we can't leave the road connection unattached, even if we have a footpath connection, which we don't. So that's one issue. We need some sort of a connection to the road through the hamlet so that the workers can reach the factory easily. And to be clear, since most of the workers are not living locally in Malakaz but coming off the buses, then we need to be within walking distance of the bus stop. Plus, if we didn't connect the road, then this building would burn down as fire engines couldn't reach it. Now, it is generally good practice, I think, to avoid having your factories or other buildings like tech offices to be directly connected to a busy main road like this. And after careful consideration and some testing, of course, I am confident the traffic through this entrance to the new factory will be quite low, especially once I designed a solution for the wood deliveries. Anyway, that allows me to then place this asset reasonably safely to connect direct to the main road, and we can align it with the owner's house to form a nice little open front yard area. By the way, it can go almost right up against the road if I wanted to, like this. So far, I've replaced a pretty safe loading-unloading setup that used the large open space to avoid any traffic on the main road, and instead got a potentially risky setup with the only connection almost right on the road. So the other change I made was sort out the factory connections. Factory connections, like roads, footpaths, etc., have a minimum length. So, as well as the collision on the buildings, the factory connections often force you to spread buildings apart that in real life would probably be built next to each other. But we can't get around that. First, because we disable collision. Second, because if a factory connection, say, must be more than 10 metres long, it's actually more like 11 metres, then we can place 5 metres of it inside of one building and 5 metres of it inside the other. And that's what I've done here. You can see the factory connection arrow is not at the edge of the asset, but deep inside of it. And in this case, I haven't gone for half and half. Most of the factory connection is inside the factory. You can see that it is connected and is going to be built. We can clearly see it on the ground with most of it inside the factory. The important thing is that the connection is not just within the hitbox of the asset, i.e. inside the yellow line around the asset, but it must be inside of the 3D model which will cover the surface, or inside of one of the gravel or asphalt areas. The game will build and render the ugly factory connection on the ground, but you won't actually be able to see it. And you can see that I could get the cargo station very close and most of the factory connection is hidden in the model. But I just couldn't get it quite all the way. Still, that's pretty close, a big improvement. Let's just show a picture I took of building these two assets together with collision enabled and no attempt to hide the factory connection. You can't build either close to the road, nor close to each other, even if you don't want them to connect. If you do want them to connect, then you have to have at least an 11 metres long connection between the buildings, often much longer. Instead of the vanilla building, which is pretty big, there's this nice little cargo loading mod, which takes up far less room and is just basically a way to add 2 more loading bays to your assets. Really cool, but with a little magic we can even improve that. And now you can't see the factory connection at all. It's mainly under the 3D model of the factory and partly under the gravel area of the cargo loading. And you see that this gravel cargo loading area now displays as if it is an integral part of the factory. You can't tell that they are not part of the same asset. So ideally we need this effect of hiding the factory connection on the asset we are connecting to the factory. In this case, not the cargo loading bays, but the storage warehouse. And that's exactly what I have done with the warehouse here, setting the factory connection far enough inside of the 3D model that we can get the two assets to completely adjoin and still make the factory connection. Now, because the game is not always totally reliable to make factory connections automatically, and we can't see it now, that's why I have construction turned on. I want to definitely make sure there is a factory connection inside there and it gets built. If the game is going to make the factory connection for us, then the construction office will detect it and we can select it from there. Note, we are playing that these are not new buildings in 1910. The bread factory was here before 1910, so we can pay for these. But I enabled construction just to delay building so we could be sure the factory connection would be there. If you were playing in realistic mode, you would have to demolish and rebuild them if you got this wrong. So it's worth being very, very careful. So now we have the factory and storage closer together than they were, and also both can be much closer to the edge of the site along the main road. Now, I also made some adjustments to the warehouse, not just to its factory connections. I shortened the 2 loading bays on this gravel area and moved them towards the road, so they are closer to that little doorway. But that leaves an area of gravel behind the loading bays, and we can use that. The game allows multiple types of storage to be in the same asset. I don't mean 2 types of covered storage resources like crops and food. I mean that you can have covered storage and open storage and cement. any combination you want, and normally these combined warehouses that you can find in the workshop have been designed to provide a building that looks appropriate. Now, to be fair, there's no reason why you couldn't place steel, bricks, etc. inside a building like this. Open storage resources don't have to stay outside in the rain, but it's not a very big building and I don't want to have to reduce the size of the crop and food storage. But there's no reason why the owner of this building can't use that gravel area behind the loading bays for some open storage. Why not? Clearly it's not a big area, but if we can get 90 tons of crops inside the building, then there's no reason why we can't put, say, 20 tons of open storage outside. And we can set up visualization of that open storage so that you can see that there have been deliveries dropped off there. And of course, I'm going to use it for wood to burn in the factory rather than for construction material. Now, if I instead rotate the warehouse, I can build it so that the road connection is pointing away from the main road. So you can see that we can now build a warehouse that fits right up to the factory. Plus, we can make deliveries of wood to the warehouse rather than direct to the factory. When the factory wants to burn wood, it will just pull the wood through the factory connection. We can put an access road in here and we will be able to join it to the warehouse. And all vehicles for the factory, wood, crops and food, will come to the back of the factory complex, away from the main road. And now the best bit. We have the wood storage, but the gravel area for the warehouse seems to have disappeared from here on the left, and we can't see the visualization of the wood. Because it's here. You can just about see in the area between the two buildings that there are two loading bays. They are the loading bays for the warehouse, not the factory. And that wood is now within that area between the two buildings. But it is the wood in the warehouse, not the factory. The factory itself has its own internal open storage for wood, and if we buy from the factory, it also appears in that same area, but in a separate pile. And finally, there is a road connection here from between the two buildings, but it's the road connection for the warehouse, not the factory. The factory still has its road connection for water, sewage and fire at the front of the building, but everything else can be delivered to the back. I hope that makes sense. But what we have now got are two separate buildings as far as the game is concerned, that in a vanilla setup do function together, but by carefully modding them, we have something that takes up far less space on the map, and in my opinion, looks far more realistic. You cannot tell that these are not just one single asset. The game is capable of this. It's a shame that it needs so much effort to set it up like this, but I at least got a lot of satisfaction from working this out and seeing the area visibly improved and then be able to share that with you. We are eventually going to build an old city, and these techniques are going to be put into effect throughout the city. We are not going to have a city sprawled out over a massive area. It's going to be compact, fitting as much as we can into nearly every part of the city. If we leave some space, we're going to have to explain it. So let's finish this off, because in the original setup we also had a 4-vehicle distribution office on the site, serving the needs of the factory, bringing wood and crops here and distributing food to the shops. That design of distribution office, which I have used several times already in Kazinchad, just won't fit here in the corner, or rather the building will fit but the roads will not. So let's use the new 3-vehicle versions of distribution offices I just published in the workshop and that we used next to the woodcutter. So the 3-vehicle one can easily fit here, and because it sits further back, it can be made to connect to the road layout. And we can buy 3 covered hulls. Now, just to pause while we have this screen open to buy horse-drawn vehicles, you see every one of them is duplicated. The 3 at the top are publicly available in the workshop with the green icons, while the 3 below with the blue icons are ones I developed. The blue icon means they are work in progress, i.e. they are mods which are stored on my machine for my own use. I now have hundreds like that just from the work I have done on this series. So I changed every single horse-drawn asset I had. They are great for the period, of course. There's some jankiness that you can't help, but my issue was that these all had red rear lights implemented on them, so they would flash when the horses slowed down to go round a corner, or when riding at night. I can only assume that the modders had copied the files from Cars and never thought about removing the lights. The developer does not force you to have lights on a vehicle, it's optional. Anyway, I couldn't ignore it once I noticed. That meant I had to swap all of the vehicles I had already bought for ones with no lights. Anyway, let's buy the ones with no lights and get the bread company back up and running. I will set that to collect crops and distribute food off camera. I copied this asset from the vanilla village houses and made it into a ploppable building. It has no functionality in the game, but I think it looks more like an outhouse for the factory and just fills that corner nicely. And let's build a fence and you can see how much of the site is now free. I haven't decided what to put there. If you have any ideas, feel free to make a suggestion in the comments below. Maybe some more cottages for workers or some middle-class housing for people who live outside the city. Maybe Malakaz should have a small church or a pub. But it also could be a further industrial site. Small, but I could probably make it work. Finally, we have this tiny one-vehicle distribution office in the same style as the three-vehicle building. We can build it here, right up next to the warehouse. How cute is that? Again, not my model. I took the two 3D models that someone published ages ago. They just had open areas at the front with the parking on the mud. So I made variations with gravel and asphalt parking. Give some of them a little fuel storage for when you have more modern vehicles which need refueling, etc. And made some skins for them. So now we have not only totally hidden the ugly factory connection, but provided buildings which are much closer together. And just look like they are one single unit, the factory and the warehouse, as if they were built that way. And we included around them more old housing and the distribution offices. We packed an awful lot into this small area. And for a bit of fun, just to compare, here's the vanilla small distribution office that holds just 5 vehicles. And it completely fills the whole site, and nothing else could be here. And finally, we now also have the room here to build a couple of workers' cottages next to the road. So instead of a single vanilla building in this area, we have 3 accommodation buildings, a factory, a storage warehouse, and 2 distribution offices. 7 modded buildings in total. And soon we are getting food appearing in the warehouse. The factory is busy with plenty of people working here. And if we look along the list of people here, they nearly all are coming here from Kazinchad. Our bus service is doing great work. Our problem now is what to do with all the food. There's far more being produced than we need just for the 2 small shops in Kazinchad and Malakaz. And temporarily I will tell the distribution office that it can take any surplus to the customs house and sell it, though that is quite far away from here and it is pretty inefficient. What we need is a city and deliver most of it there. It's coming. And would come sooner if I didn't spend so much time designing one single business. But I hope you like the outcome. One issue that I noticed since the last episode building Malakaz was that there were 2 roads on the sawmill, both of which went to the main village. And the buses were happy to take this very slightly shorter route, even though this is a mud road through the farm. The horses are still going that way. The main road has a very sharp corner here near the water services, partly because it needed to join with the roundabout that was originally here as part of the highway that I spent episode 1 and 2 building, then demolished in episode 6. To force the buses to take the main road, I had to use a waypoint, and these look awful for an early start. So I decided to change the road layout slightly and cut the corner off here. This makes the bus route along this road slightly shorter, enough to make the traffic AI use the gravel road. And after further consideration of what to do with all the land round here, I decided just to remove the mud road completely. You may recall that road had started in episode 1 as the real-life road which joined the highway to the road through the village past the sportswear factory. So in 1910 that little road probably did not exist. This leaves a nice area here by the road that it looks like we can use, but we have to remember that we cannot build anything within the range of the water well. Roads and some other infrastructure are okay, but any buildings or fields affect the water quality. So this area needs to be left clear on this side of the road, but from here down to the sawmill, this can be developed. Or rather, it has already been developed before 1910. Back at home that evening, Istvan Kovacs is spending time with his wife. At dinner he tells her about his trip to the city, how it went with the lawyers and the bank, and his meeting with Jan Horvath to arrange the building of the new electrical powerhouse on the estate. Istvan says to her, "With any luck, by the time you give birth next January, we may have electricity in Kazinchad. We can provide all of the modern luxuries that come with that. Our son is going to grow up in a much better world." His wife is surprised. "Our son? We may have a girl." "Yes, and that will be wonderful too, but something makes me think it will be a boy. I stopped at the cathedral before I left the city and made a donation." She looked at him curiously. "You think that making a donation to the church will get you a son? I didn't think you were a religious man." Istvan laughed. "No, not at all. I thought making a donation would help keep the bishop happy, and his brother is probably going to be mayor next year. It's good to keep that family happy. They have all sorts of contacts in Budapest. I heard that there are still people opposed to the electrification in the city, and that's caused enough political problems. I don't want them interfering here in Kazinchad, and I still need to pull various strings to get my plans in place. I'm determined to see this through. I am not going to make the same mistakes my father made." "Oh, Istvan, he was such a gentleman. Everyone loved him." "Yes, but he didn't really understand the modern world. We could have had the railway station here in Kazinchad, you know. But he wasn't interested in selling the railway company any of his land." "No, I didn't realize that. I just assumed they preferred to build in Malakaz or something. It seems fine where it is. The railway is a dirty, noisy thing anyway. I much prefer to visit the city by carriage." Istvan remarked, "Indeed, and I had a very pleasant drive today. The weather was fine.
though you have to admit that when you want to go home to Prague, taking the train is far easier than the couple of days it would take in the carriage. She nodded. Anyway, the station is very well positioned for the sawmill and the bread factory. I'm sure the owners were very happy to get the station on their doorstep, but I'm going to need coal for the powerhouse. We can get much better results with burning coal than wood, and I need the railway company to agree to supply it. I have a meeting with the managing director in a few weeks to make the arrangements. Fortunately, we have met before, and I know his son well. I know he wants the extra business we can bring. In episode 8 we will see Istvan's plans progressing. We know now there is a railway in our republic and that it has a part to play in the development of Kazinchad, even if it doesn't pass right through the village, and that it has been playing a role for some years in taking boards from the sawmill and food from the bread factory. The railway has been responsible for helping those businesses to develop. Can it help Istvan to develop his estate, which is based on woodcutting and farming? We will see. In real life, by 1910, Kosice had rail for nearly 30 years, with a main line connecting it to the south to Budapest. So railways in our republic are going to be already well established before 1910. We need to build them, of course. But we can justify buying them and not having to go through years of grief with railway construction officers. And you also know now that Kosice had a tram system in 1910, so hopefully we can have great fun with that. But it's essential that we have decent infrastructure and supplies of some basic resources that can be delivered to the city before we suddenly get a population of a few thousand people. Things are moving slowly, but I hope they remain interesting in the gameplay, the story, and the real-life history of the technology and how it affected Slovakia in 1910. Feel free to comment on any of that below. I really appreciate the positive comments, and it is a real boost that some people have subscribed to the channel to follow along on this journey. Anyway, my name's Mark from Canny Gaming, and I'm out of here.